Welcome to the Team Teach podcast. I'm Clare, and in each episode you'll find me talking with an expert guest to learn more about behaviour. We squeeze a lot into each episode. You'll listen to the latest thinking in behaviour, continue your professional development with our book recommendation, and then I'll send you away with 3 practical tips you can use in your setting. I'm joined today by Kat Booker, and we are talking about positive touch. Hi Kat, how are you?
Hi, nice to see you.
I had Kat on previously, so we're really pleased to have you back on today. Could you give a quick intro to the listener, a bit about yourself?
Yep, sure. So I'm Kat. I was a primary school teacher for many years, predominantly in SEMH settings. I then graduated or moved on to working in mainstream. I worked a lot with Nurture UK and setting up nurture groups and became a SENDCO there. And then in later years and more recently, I've become a consultant. So I do various bits of work. I do team teach training as a principal trainer. I'm a relaxed kids coach, and I do assessments for IQM sometimes, and various other bits in schools, which I love doing all these different things. So yeah, generally working in the same sort of field.
Great, and we're so lucky to have you on here, Kat. I was talking just off air about how much I enjoyed interviewing you last time, and I think I say this about all the topics, so the listeners must be sick of it, but I do. And I am very interested about the topic of positive touch. And it's something that I think quite a lot in my service about, because it's kind of a tough topic in some ways to address. But we do our reflective questions. So I'm wondering what you wish you knew then that you know now about positive touch in services.
I think I was very lucky to work in settings where we sort of talked about this from quite an early stage. But I think right back when I was a teaching assistant before I became a teacher, when I was much younger and didn't feel so confident about what I was doing, I think I wish that I'd known and been more confident about the fact that touch is a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. I think there was a kind of echo from the past about no touch policies that I think left me feeling fearful to comfort children and do the things that actually would have been the right thing to do at the time, and made me feel quite vulnerable. So I think that's what I wish I'd known at an earlier stage.
Because even off air, I was laughing about my first question, like, what is positive touch? But with your reflective bit there, I just think back to when I first was working in schools and just not really knowing that was a thing. So my background's secondary as well. So I think maybe in primary, where you might be offering more nurture, well, not to say that secondary schools don't nurture, but that's probably a different topic. But yeah, and just being really unsure of like, is it a thing in high schools, and then being like you kind of feeling really vulnerable about, even close proximity to kids. I was young. I was like, 24 or so. And it did open up just loads of questions about like, what is this? Is this a thing?
Yeah.
And you'd see some staff were more comfortable with it than others. I don't know. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you say about the sort of primary and secondary sort of perspectives on that. And it's interesting because when the reason that I've sort of have been thinking about this a lot is from the team teach training when we've talked about physical intervention when things reach a dangerous perspective, and we're thinking about that touch, but we're not really clear about the bit in between the no touch completely, where it's not necessary at all, and where it can be a supportive thing. And I think in primary settings, if you were to pose to a group of people, is it okay to touch a child, comfort a child, let's say, you've got a few issues there, because you've got the issue of what do you mean by comfort, because we think that the other person is thinking the same thing as us, but they may not be. But also when you start querying about the, but what age child are you talking about? If you say, oh, it's a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old versus you're saying it's a 10, 11, 13, 16-year-old, suddenly our interpretation shifts.
Mm.
And to me, that leaves this massive sort of chasm of grey that we're not really clear about. We're worrying about whether this is okay and whether it's not okay. And I think people's instincts are that there are times where a hand on a shoulder might very well be a totally appropriate thing to do to comfort somebody or reassure them.
Mm.
But because of that fear, because it's grey and we haven't outlined it, what we actually do is quite abnormal, and we don't offer that hand on the shoulder or whatever that low level gesture would be, that if it was somebody that was a loved one outside of a setting, we would absolutely do and would be feel quite traumatized to not do.
Mm.
But I do also think, sorry, just to throw this in as well, but we have to be really clear, and this is that difference between being professional and being an individual in your own life with your own children and loved ones. We've got to have an understanding that what we might choose to do with our own loved ones isn't the same as what we would do with people we're working with and clients or children in our settings. So for me, it brings it all back to policy, and we need to be talking about these things, and also understanding that touch isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't mean it's just open to interpretation either.
When we say that everyone can benefit from Team Teach training, we really do mean everyone. Our in-house training puts the emphasis on the unique needs of your setting and creates a consistent approach to behaviour across your entire organisation. Head over to the Team Teach website to find out more.
Yeah, and I like that chasm of grey. Yeah, really hit home, because without clear policy guidance and people having the same perspectives and ideas based on policy or conversations, however we might do it in our services, it makes it really hard. I hear people very loudly, actually, in some courses that I run, some Team Teach courses, where the fear of allegation is super high and prevalent, actually, in some services that I train. And so this idea of like, I want to comfort, I want positive touch, or even, like that bit that you were saying before crisis, or someone's distressed, where you might offer some sort of help hug or something like
Mm.
that. But then the fear culture of like, but
Yeah.
maybe that's not the right thing, and that's such a hard juggle, I think, for people.
And I think that's something we need to be talking about. I mean, the point of a policy isn't to be told what to do. It should be reflective of the practice that people are
Mhm.
carrying out in their settings. And again, I go back to, even if I was training or doing some support with a primary setting, if I said to a group of, let's say, 30 people, attendees, if I said, is it okay to sit a child on your lap here? What invariably would happen is there'd be a stunned silence. Then everybody would look towards the senior leaders. Then what would happen is somebody down in reception would bravely pipe up and say, "Well, we would sit a child on our lap if they were upset and they were missing their mummy or they'd hurt themselves." And then maybe somebody in year 2 might say, "Yeah, we do sometimes." And then someone in year 6 would suddenly say, "Well, we absolutely wouldn't." And then we start to sort of talk about, well, okay, so what if it was a year 4 child or year 3 child? What if it was a year 3 child, but they were operating more at a year 1 developmental level? What if it was a serious injury versus they were upset about something? And then we suddenly get back into this territory, whereas everybody thought they knew what they were talking about. Actually, they've all got completely different ideas about what that means. And then we get down to the nitty gritty of, what does sitting on a lap mean? Does it mean somebody sitting on your kneecap, your thigh? Are they facing you? Are they facing outwards? Are they facing sideways? Because the picture and the connotations are completely different depending on what you've got as your image in your head. So wouldn't it be better if we were having conversations as a staff about these types of things, like the types of things we might do at home, like, giving a child a quick squeeze to reassure them? What does that mean? What does it mean if we say we're going to give them a pat on the back to say well done? Is that okay? And what exactly does it mean? So I think we need to unpick some of these things and not pretend that people aren't doing them, because they are, and probably rightly so. Because actually, touch is incredibly important. Something I didn't realise till I was sort of researching about policy was touch is is actually the first sensation to develop in the womb. I always thought it was hearing, and that's way afterwards. I think it's 7 weeks. I wrote it down somewhere that touch becomes relevant, and so it's going to be really relevant to the development of young people. And if you've got people that have only ever experienced negative touch and unsafe touch, then the brains are going to wire up in different ways, aren't they? So we need to be part of that whole developmental picture.
Yeah, it really hits home when you think about children that may not have experienced touch that is safe and is comforting. I also think quite a lot about consent as well, because I think that there's a
Absolutely.
whole great piece of work that we do in my setting. So I don't know if you know that, but it's an autistic service that I work in, or a service for autistic individuals, and we work on it a lot. And it's consent of touch between child and child,
Yeah.
not just randomly going up to people and hugging them, consent, but really
Yeah.
importantly for staff, if you're going to sit near, put an arm round, whatever it is it okay to do this? And I
Absolutely.
think starting that really young and having that as part of policy, you can
Yeah.
really get the idea about autonomy in your body as well. So if
Yeah.
I was upset, I actually wouldn't want someone to put their arm around me. And if
Yeah.
someone did that automatically, I'm not going to swear on the podcast, but that would escalate me somewhat.
Yeah.
So I think it is about this positive touch, but also teaching about autonomy of body, consent, and all of these things alongside that, but having those conversations explicit,
Yeah.
put into policy. Yeah.
And I think that's where we have that wider policy that's for all. It's our broad umbrella position on things, but then we've got individual plans which can account for whether people are soothed by that touch or escalated. But also we can incorporate, we can pre-think cultural differences and preferences, family preferences, backdrops, all of those things. But as you say, consent really, as soon as consent comes into the picture, it becomes a lot less complicated. Now, of course, there are going to be times where that consent may not be possible because it's about safety. But at those lower levels, that's where we're talking about it. And we're really hot on PSHE lessons, thinking about consent in there. But actually, this is something that could be woven into our everyday practice. I mean, I think that I'd forgotten this was the first time I'd really thought about it, way back when we were learning how to and implementing in my setting years ago about doing peer massage. And one of the most incredible things about that, first of all, was that it wasn't really about massage a lot of the time. It was actually one of the most powerful things about that was that it was supporting our safeguarding policies, because at the time I was working in an SEMH setting, and suddenly what we had was an influx of children asking, is this okay, that somebody's touched me like this? Or because what's built into that system is consent. So when you give a massage to somebody, you ask for permission to touch. And then at the end of the massage, the person that gave the massage is the person that says thank you, because that was your property and you allowed me to touch you and to give you that massage. So suddenly we had a language that went with what we were talking about, and the children were able to ask questions, and they were able to say, you know, that's a bit of my body that I don't think you should be touching, or that is. So I think we've got to get away from this idea that it's taboo. Rather, we need to be much more explicit about describing, well, what do we do in our setting that allows us to be respectful, and also to create the best developmental opportunities for our children. That's not to say we do it for the sake of it, but we also need to be authentic and not do things that are bizarrely not normal and avoiding touch because we're fearful of it. So I think probably the thing I suppose I'd quite like to emphasize really is that notion of why touch is so important. Going back to that original question about the sort of what is positive touch, other than the contrast between negative touch, but also touch is essential in terms of regulation. It's a biological need. It's not something that's a sort of top up. It's touch can release oxytocin. It can do all of those feel good drugs and hormones in our body. It's going to release that, but also there's a lot of evidence to say it's part of that attachment and bonding process. So there's so many different angles that it's coming from, and I would hate anyone to be listening to this thinking cats going around hugging children left, right, and centre that don't want it. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I do think it's important that we balance the picture and we think about how are we going to talk about this as a staff and to decide what we think is appropriate, because that's one of my big red flag words is appropriate, because appropriate is different for different people. So we've got to outline what is appropriate and how are we going to ask for consent, and is this necessary and when isn't it, and where is appropriate to touch somebody. Is it okay to touch them in the middle of their back and on their spine, or is it better to touch their upper arm, for example? And we can be mindful about those things. That was a long old rant.
Getting those never can. No, it's really got me thinking that this notion and kind of what the episode is called is positive touch. And I've had this question in my mind that might be really hard to answer. And I apologize in advance because this is like not something that I planned, but it's just come up for me, is that at what point does it move in away from positive touch? And I'm thinking more so in line with really team teach courses that, you know, when we might offer a help hug and kind of guide someone away, is that still where we're gonna place that as, you know, under this title? It's slightly made up, the name, like positive touch, isn't it? But is that where we're going to place that? And at what point is touch like problematic in our service as well? I know that's probably conversation service to service, but
So, well, this is the thing. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think we need to consider it to be something on a continuum rather than there's a hard line there. And therefore our policies and procedures need to reflect that, because actually I think at the moment, thinking about, you know, sort of examples of where things have become dangerous further down the line, sometimes if people hadn't been so worried about that positive, reassuring hand on the shoulder, that may have prevented that escalating. So actually, sometimes what we're doing could be causing that to escalate. Similarly, as you've said, if that's pitched at the wrong person because we don't know that young person or adult well enough, because we're not reading plans or sharing plans or investing our time to get to know them, then it could be the trigger. So either way, we've got a whole continuum in terms of developmental stages, experiences, sensitivities, all of those different things that need to be accounted for. So it's not a simple question of, you know, is this okay or not? I don't know if I answered your question really then.
No, you have. You have, exactly, because it's to brandish touch, like positive touch, then unsafe touch, it's impossible. Like, life doesn't work like that. There is a massive continuum in between those things. And I think what you're, driving forward there is that we have policies that have that spectrum of touch, and we're quite open about it. And one thing that's been highlighted for me is kind of like the self checklist. Is this okay? Is this consensual? Have I asked for consent? What do I know about this child, young person, adult, whoever I'm working with? Like, almost within those policies, that you have like that safety checklist that everyone follows. Because also, actually, as a staff member, my comfort for positive touch and actually administering positive touch, oh, it's such a weird word to say, isn't it? It's not very nurturing and caring, administering positive touch or whatever, may be really different from yours. Like, I'm not massively tactile, but still within the consent things, but almost just having like this checklist for staff as well. So then you have a choice kind of within it, where it's not that, this is how it must be done, and you must be hugging 10 times a day.
And we're not talking about having a touch curriculum here, where staff are forced to do things they didn't want to do. I think that's where the authenticity and again, policy should be reflective of the staff that are currently in the building. That authenticity. Well, children, let alone adults, can see when people aren't being authentic. I would never force you to do that, Claire. I wouldn't force you to have a hug from me. But, it's the same kind of thing, isn't it? But having said that, we also know from when we're doing our Team Teach training that there are things like personal space, for example, where there are times where we have to suck up our uncomfortableness in favour of what's important for that young person at that moment, depending on the level of risk. So, for example, I wouldn't say to a young person who was standing way too close for my comfort to get out of my personal space, and remember the time we talked about that, if they were distressed. But I might talk to them about it when they're calmer and say, let's talk about where is the right place to stand. So similarly, again, thinking about your settings, perhaps, the conversations about touch are best suited to when we're relaxed and calm and what's okay. And that's when we might talk about, I personally, as an adult, don't really like it when people stand this close to me. Would you mind? So that we've got an understanding of real world scenarios. It needs to be, reflective of real life, ultimately, because that's what education's all about, isn't it? Future lives. One thing I was thinking about when you were talking about consent, another thing that crops up when we're doing Team Teach is, we talk about sometimes holding hands with children, and at our very low level of prompts, we talk about, sometimes what I'll do is I'll go up to somebody on the course and put my hand out and say, and start to sort of offer my hand. And often, 9 times out of 10, staff take my hand and I lead them across the road and say, would you mind just standing there? And afterwards, when I say to staff, what did I do? They'll say, oh, you took their hand and you went across the room. And I said, I didn't take your hand, did I? I offered you a hand. And this is where that sense of consent is, but also control. And one of the biggest things for me that crops up when we're talking about behaviours that we can find challenging sometimes as a staff body, it often comes down to lack of control, or young people and children seeking control in their lives for whatever reason, whether it's to do with backdrops or whether it's to do with their own needs. That giving, the difference between me offering a hand and giving you the choice whether you take it or not, or whether I take it, is massive. Because if somebody took my hand, no matter how politely they did it, I would feel a slight resistance to that because somebody is dominating over me. So these little subtleties are things we need to talk about as well.
Yeah, there is massive differences between those two scenarios. It's been fascinating, Kat. I think there's loads to reflect on, actually. And I'm really looking forward to having a read of your blog post that you've done about it. Or have I missold that?
Oh no, I'm writing it.
Are you writing it?
It won't be long. But what is going to be coming out very soon is some guidance on how to write a touch and physical contact policy.
Amazing. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and then
Great,
there will be a blog that follows along after that, hopefully.
Okay, great. And we'll all keep an eye out for that, because I think, there's loads to reflect on and think on. But I just wondered if you could finish with 3 top tips for the listener.
Yeah, sure. I think the first and foremost, sort of talking about that sort of consent issue and knowing people, is talk to families, talk to children, and before even thinking about talking to staff about what we're doing here, is get everybody involved to get their voice heard, and that can then incorporate culture, etc. Then the next part of that is get that policy and get everyone's voice involved in creating a policy about what do we mean by positive touch, or even avoiding that word positive and just getting a policy in place. And then that final part is training staff and having it as an open, ongoing conversation that we revisit frequently. So yeah, that's my 3.
That's amazing, Kat. Really enjoyed it, as always, chatting to you, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Fabulous.
You've been listening to the Team Teach podcast. It's been great to have you here with us as we discuss behaviour, communication, and the ways we can best support those in our care. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.